Hi, everyone, and welcome to our March session of MarketRX. If this is your first session ever, I'm host Sumitra Iwansky, and I'll be here behind the scenes. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. If you're joining us here on StreamYard and run into any technical issues, feel free to message me from the chat. If you're watching on any available platform like LinkedIn or YouTube, please use the chat to drop comments in, and we have a producer watching those as well. If you have questions for Bill or Holley, if you put those in the chat, we'll make sure we get to them during the Q&A. We'll try to address as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. So now let's jump in. Welcome to our first 2026 MarketRX session, the Product Adoption Lie, Lessons from the Front Lines. We're speaking with Dr. Bill Kerr about his experience with navigating the product adoption lie, the myth that better products automatically win, and how he thinks about introducing new technology now. Bill is CEO of Avalon Healthcare Solutions. He's a pediatric oncologist by training and has held leadership roles at multiple payer organizations. Avalon was founded to scale laboratory science into the healthcare ecosystem to proactively ensure appropriate care and enhanced clinical outcomes. As you'll hear in our discussion, Bill and Avalon have evolved to enable the transformation of complex diagnostic data into clear, evidence-based decisions, reducing cost, improving care, and driving measurable value. With experience as a provider, researcher, and executive, Bill brings valuable experience to this discussion about how product launches can stall due to factors innovators never expected. This conversation will let you into the mind of a life sciences leader who busted the myth that better products naturally win. You'll see how important it is for your success to understand that adoption isn't automatic and that most failed launches share the same pattern. In each case, the company changed the technology, but didn't change the market's mind. With that, I'll hand you over to your host, Holley Miller, founder of Gray Matter.
Hi, everyone. I'm Holley Miller. Thanks so much for joining us. I founded Gray Matter nearly 20 years ago to help life science companies solve one of the hardest problems in healthcare. It's not building innovation, it's actually getting the market to adopt it. Most CEOs and commercial leaders fall into the same trap. They assume product superiority plus sales readiness equals launch success. Yet 2 out of 3 launches fail. And that's what we call the product adoption lie. Adoption isn't automatic, it has to be designed. At Gray Matter, we help companies design the conditions that make their innovation the only choice the market is wired to want. It's called healthcare category design. And it's a strategy behind companies that redefine healthcare, how it's being delivered, and create outsized financial results. We need more innovation to become standards of care, not cautionary tales. So that's exactly what today's conversation is about. We're going to review a common scenario where the product was strong, but adoption lagged until the problem was reframed in the market and they had a reason to change. Bill, we've known each other for a few years now, and working with you as a client and watching you turn that work into ongoing success has been really rewarding for me. Thank you again for joining today and for your time. As the CEO of Avalon, you've launched multiple products now. You've changed the commercial strategy, and you've won increasing levels of investment that supports your mission to deliver the diagnostic intelligence. That means it's really giving a new means for how patient care can be transformed, starting with lab data, right? Lab intelligence. And so under your leadership, the company has been recognized for, growth, for innovation, for being a phenomenal place to work. And so I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you, Holley. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and when you launched Avalon, there must have been a clear need, and you believe that lab benefits management solution was your option was better than the current alternatives in the category. You weren't the first, right? But you thought you were better. Did the market see it the same way as you did?
No, and let me explain sort of what we thought was better, and then we can peel that back a little bit if that works. So, first of all, we think lab is important because we think ultimately getting the diagnosis right is step one in good care. And if you don't do that, then you've missed an opportunity. And the science of lab testing has been evolving rapidly over the past 15 years. And we saw an opportunity to help scale that science into the ecosystem faster. What we saw happening was a lot of people focused on genetics, but not realizing that routine test management also had innovation, and that the combination of innovation and genetics and routine also is driving waste. So there was an opportunity to save money while adopting good science. Because we identified a problem that really the customers weren't sitting there saying they had, we spent a lot of time in the early days, I would argue, kind of selling a problem, just trying to convince them then that the solution was relevant. So that was a bit of an interesting sort of challenge. And the early days, we felt like savings was the thing to hang our hat on, that affordability was the angle to take. And even though we thought that we had some decent savings, $1.50 PMPM, $2, that adds up to real dollars for health plans, it was not moving the needle very quickly. And candidly, it wasn't a C-suite initiative. And I would argue, to maybe forecast some headlines, we needed to be more relevant to the C-suite to get there. And so sold the problem, started selling a solution. Solution wasn't resonating. We were getting some traction, but honestly, it was a slog. We like to joke now, thank you for all the accolades earlier, but we're a 10-year overnight success. It took a while to gain traction. And I think that's part of what we're sort of here to talk about today.
It's interesting because I think we often talk about the value of problem marketing, right? You're trying to explain, hey, you've got this issue, we can fix it for you. But sometimes the problem you're solving is perceived in the market as more of a nice to have, not a must have. And it sounds like even though you were delivering meaningful, $45 million savings, $1 million savings a year, it just wasn't, again, to your point, attracting the sense of urgency from that C-suite. And so what was your team surprised? Did they think it was obvious and the market just didn't understand the value the same way? Or where do you think that disconnect kind of started?
So one of the first things we started seeing kind of relevant to the conversation is that our biggest competition wasn't alternative lab solutions. It was alternative strategic projects. So, whether it was executive mindshare or IT resources, projects that were taking that up was what was displacing our ability to get traction. So that was one. We were like, well, that's interesting. How do we become relevant to the C-suite? Two, we debated whether we needed to also lower kind of what I might call the hurdle rate to get adopted, like make it easier. And then internally, we all sort of had an opinion of why it wasn't getting adopted, either because it was too cross silos within the health plan. It was, I already mentioned, too hard to adopt. So we had a number of internal debates about that. And we spent some time experimenting by kind of tweaking things. I would joke at times we're sort of throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks, which wasn't very strategic. But so what we saw was we were getting displaced by other more strategic projects. We weren't sure the real problem. We attempted to make some tweaks to our product, both in how it was positioned and how it was deployed. And yet we were still sort of struggling to get as much traction as we thought the solution deserved.
Yeah, it's interesting, again, to your point, you guys, you jokingly said, 10-year overnight success. You guys had spent a lot of time on the problem and the solution, but maybe you, again, just, the market wasn't really seeing it the same way. And so I guess that's, a hard lesson to learn initially, which is just because your product is ready doesn't guarantee the market is ready. So this availability doesn't exactly create inevitability, I guess, for lack of a better term. So you guys had the, clinical confidence, you got organizational alignment, right? And you had the solution, but the market still kind of viewed you, I don't want to say as a nice to have, but to your point, there were other more acute, urgent things that were vying for their attention and vying for their prioritization and probably vying for their money, right? And so that was translating to anemic adoption, maybe a lag of what you guys expected. So when you think about looking at it that way of kind of the internal alignment and market readiness, it seems like it took a little bit of, I don't want to say testing, but evaluation on how do we shift from explaining features, it's just this much money per member per month savings equates to this, to actually changing the way your customer believed, like what they actually believed in. Because what I've always come to find out, Bill, is that people don't buy what you make. They buy what you make happen for them, right? So you had to make them realize you were going to unlock something that was valuable enough to get their attention.
Yep. Yeah. Look, we really had to get our arms around the fact that we were selling diagnostic insights. And what does that mean? It's a good phrase, but what it really means is everything else you health plan are doing to promote adherence to care pathways, whether that, and I've done it myself, value-based care, case management, disease management, all that stuff presumes the diagnosis is right. But if you don't do the right workup and use the results correctly, then all of that's a waste. And that started connecting us to a bigger problem where we could be the tip of the spear, is what we sort of talking about, at the top of the waterfall, that if you miss this part, then all this other investment you're making is not going to be a good investment. And that started getting us more traction. In retrospect, we learned how to talk about it. We were starting to learn how to talk about it with your help and on our own a bit, but COVID also helped us in the following sense. It was such a case study that said, we have this problem. Everyone, we don't know what tests to do. We don't know who should do it. We don't know what to pay for it. And we certainly don't know what to do with the result, which is what gets you into the care pathways. And so for all of us having lived through that, I think that was the storyboard that started positioning us and aligning us to problems that they cared about. Because the problems they cared about is, can I change physician behavior through value-based care and education? Can I change member behavior through incentives and inform and educate? But if what I'm doing is changing it to the wrong condition, that's a problem. So we got better alignment to the problems they had. We also had to listen to them more than I think we had done. I think we had done quite a bit of, we tend to be a company of scientists, engineers, and data people. So you tend to think you can problem solve on your own. And we had to do a little bit more listening, I think, which is, if you can ask my family, not always my forte.
I think that's a great point, which is, a lot of times you're making assumptions, right, about, how they think, what they see, how they talk about things. But by really listening to those, to that feedback, it really helps sharpen that message. And I think, as you were sharing that, it seems like the problem wasn't really explaining Avalon's features, but like why proving it mattered enough to the customer, right? And so when you were saying, everyone's got an opinion, how do you essentially get everyone to be rowing in the same direction and framing it in the context of what matters most to the customer?
Yeah, so I think when you say everyone has an opinion, I'm going to start with everyone inside the company has an opinion. And that was, first of all, great team, great experience, a right to believe we had the right opinion. And because we tend to be what I just outlined, sort of scientists, data people, engineers, very, as you said, sort of solution focused. I used to sometimes joke that if we were selling cars, we'd be the people who said, here's how much torque's inside the engine and how fast the piston goes, not the people who realize 0 to 60 in 0.3 seconds is what you care about. So as we started having conversations with C-suite people, as we started listening better, we started understanding, as I've alluded to, that the problems they cared about was, are we getting the right care delivered to our members in a cost-effective way? Because if we're promoting the wrong care, then the outcomes are not what we've committed to deliver to them. And so making it easier to connect then our work to that, i.e. the tip of the spear, and then how we can empower you, how we're an enabler of the outcomes you care about, was very helpful to us, as I've mentioned. So it was kind of getting more outside ourselves to get input that drove more alignment, I would argue. And that goes back to the then listening a bit to the customer and really trying to understand what they cared about. And we were trying to connect ourselves then to things that resonated with them, kind of things that they cared about, not only sort of as business outcomes, but you could see, I think this is not uncommon in healthcare, people get gravitated to healthcare because they really have a case study in their own family where something didn't go right and they didn't get the care they needed. And so people do want to see their family members get the care they needed. And connecting to that was really an emotional connection that I think changed sort of how our product resonated.
Yeah, I love that because I think, it all seems obvious now, hindsight, 2020. But I think when you reframed the real problem and the impact of not fixing that problem, it really, I would say, elevated your solution as, wow, like we can't afford not to do this, right? So it wasn't really a product problem. It was really this market belief that you had to reframe around how they need to think about diagnostic accuracy and how that chain of event, right? That's the first domino, that falls. And I think it sounds like you really sensed a shift almost in receptivity, maybe even traction, people starting to, nod their head yes, maybe getting meetings with these, payers was easier to do. So any insights you can share about, like, once that was crystallized, did you actually feel a momentum change?
Yeah. And let me share an anecdote that I think ties to that. So a lot of plans appropriately struggled with what type of genetic testing should be covered. And in genetic testing, there's multiple things to worry about. Just when should you cover a test, but also how much analysis should happen, i.e. number of mutations, things like that. And I think one of the problems early on was that kind of before we got in this business, the phrase precision diagnostics, precision medicine actually had been used too long. And that was because people could run mutation analyses, but there was nothing to do about it. The example I always like, because I come from a cancer background, was you still got the same chemotherapy that more or less is what we call a cell cycle inhibitor. It kills cells that are growing, even if you have a certain mutation or the other. Well, what started happening a half dozen years ago is there were actually therapies that could be selected that actually target the mutation. And as we started connecting our story to, well, being under invested or not having the coverage for these tests is causing your members to not get targeted therapy. And that targeted therapy has a lower side effect profile. And that results in fewer ER visits and hospitalizations. Suddenly it started resonating that, oh, I've got to not only do the first test that says you've got cancer, I've got to do the next test that says which therapy should I get on. And I've got to know how to use that result correctly, because in 40% of the instances, the wrong drug selected. So I think that was the type of alignment we had to get to the outcome they cared about, which was correct therapy, lower side effects, and ultimately for them, lower cost too. So it was a win-win for the patient, the doctor, and the health plan.
I love that example. It really brings it to life. Even with that kind of belief shift, it seems like healthcare still has enormous inertia. So let's talk a little bit about why you think the status quo holds so tightly. Why is it so powerful in healthcare? Why is it so hard to get change?
So I have spent 25 years trying to figure out the best way to promote cost quality access. I've been on multiple sides of the equation. One of them is when you're a fifth of the economy, there's a lot of momentum just in the status quo. There's money and information and regulations and technology, and it's got a certain amount of flow. The second one is if you change one component, everything else shuffles, and many times can be resistance to that. And if you shift from we're doing this type of testing to that, somebody lost out on the testing. So there's momentum, there's tectonic plates that fight each other, and there's the fact that change can in fact create winners and losers that didn't exist before. And I think that is very hard in healthcare. I think it's very hard when you're trying to do it at an outcomes level and at a scalable level. Like, we're not trying to do this ultimately we want per patient to be affected, but we're trying to do this where the industry adopts the right testing and changes practice patterns. And so I think that momentum and that tectonic plate resistance is what I've come to call it, is a real challenge. And I think behind it is the win or loser challenge a little bit, that somebody who is today's primary method of testing and is tomorrow's not their primary method of testing, or today's primary method of treatment. So if I go back to the cancer example for a second, there can be the situation where we physicians make money administering certain drugs in our offices. And some of these newer drugs we prescribe through the pharmacy. It's better care, but maybe there's a negative impact economically. I'm not saying that's always the case, but it definitely is an incentive there. So that's an example of change can be hard because there's consequences to that change.
It's an unfortunate reality, but it is a reality. And I think we've talked to a lot of different companies and CEOs, and I think might be like a little bit of belief that I recognize it's hard to enact change, but we're so good, we're going to be so valuable that we're not going to have the same level of resistance, or the pace will be quicker. What do you think you underestimated about how entrenched the current system was?
I think part of what I underestimated was how to drive change, in all honesty. So I think the entrenchment is there, and I've learned about over time. What I've come to believe is it may be better to find a place where you can start to make a small amount of change and grow it slowly. The example I've come to use is I think about the way, trickles of water started eroding into rock that ultimately caused the Grand Canyon. It wasn't blown up overnight. And so I think that whenever you are getting innovation out there, it is a change management process. And I think if you try to change it all at once, it's harder. So I think one of the things I like about, say, starting with laboratory is it's only 10% of spend, but it controls 70% of decisions. Okay, let's just start with some of the lab testing we're doing. Then let's say, should you change how you use the results of that test? Then we say, should you order additional tests based on that drive therapeutic decisions? So the change is a little more slow. So I think you have to establish a bit of a beachhead, get some proof points, because it ultimately is a change management process. And I think if I look back on some of the challenges early on, a big bang approach to our product suite was probably a bit too much change at once, given some of the things we talked about, and a bit more giving a little more flexibility to get started small and expand big has worked a bit better.
I think you make a good point, which is, change is hard, in any circumstance, even if there's alignment, just the process, right? The methodology, the protocols, everything. It's just a lot of moving pieces, right? And so I think, to your point, finding a way to take your first bite, right? Take your first step can be really helpful to get the process going, knowing that it will continue to scale and expand. But if you try to boil the ocean, as people say, you're just not going to get the same results. So you obviously, as a company, had a key insight that we're not just a lab benefit management system. We're really, offering diagnostic intelligence that created a higher order of value and urgency for customers to get on board and make this adoption. Can you talk a little bit about the belief that had to shift in the customer's mind? It sounds like it had to go from, we're just saving you money for your lab benefits, to now we're really giving we're unlocking something that you desperately need. You just haven't thought about it before. So it was almost like, again, reframing what they had to believe. So was it a belief that had to shift? Was it a specific stakeholder that had to shift that then kind of unlocked it for you all?
Yeah, first of all, let me apologize if I glitched a little bit. I saw my website freeze for a second, so my apologies on that. I think two things. To restate some of it was we ultimately need to get closer to issues that the the reason I think the C-suite caring about the issue was important is because of the change management process, right? I think it's change management side, the customers, customers, companies, and then the ecosystem in which they operate. I would argue to you that the anecdote plays such a strong role in decision making, and we were really attacking with data for all the reasons I've already outlined. Our predilection to be data driven, our predilection to be scientists. Science is our true north. All of which makes a ton of sense. But what you don't realize sometimes when you're working with people is that they've got their own sort of anecdote in the back of their mind. Well, we've tried more genetic testing and it just costs us money. Whatever the anecdote is, we tried that one. I had the one parent who had this. I have a neighbor who had that. So I think one of the things we started getting better at doing was trying to understand how to tell our story in an anecdotal way so that we were better at the narrative and then attaching the data to that. If you kind of watch my natural predilection and this affected the way we designed the product, went in with a lot of data, a lot of information on savings, a lot of information on under testing, over testing, but not able to link that to the story of the patient journey. And I think then their anecdotal concerns were harder for them to change when I was just pounding it with data. So I think understanding that everybody has an anecdote, understanding that you need to describe your own for me, at least for us, it was describe our own product in the way that it affects a patient journey that could maybe show how their anecdote could be changed was important to giving us the chance to start that small change and start to have an effect. And we have found that helps better. The land and expand approach, as has been noted here, turned out to be much better than the big bang approach.
It's interesting. This is one of the most common, kind of arguments we have with clients in the space, which is, you touched on it. Data alone rarely convinces people to change their behavior because, to your point, we really make decisions based on emotion and then we use data to justify it. Right. And so if you just present data, those anecdotes, those personal experiences, training, what have you, it's just too strong. And so I love the fact that you were able to find a way to connect the dots and thread that needle. So it became, so obvious and so simple that they then found their own way to justify it and defend it. So it became, the new standard. I think there's a quote by, is it Victor Hugo? Something like, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come, or whatever it is. But I think there's something that it maybe seems like it was easy or happened very quickly, but as you've laid out, it was actually very deliberate. You were really engineering the conditions that allowed those kind of alignments to happen. I'm curious to you, once you recast or, kind of refined how you were positioning your diagnostic intelligence, what impact did it have on the company? And it can be, tangible ways and also intangible ways.
So just to start with data, which I just said I was going to not do because it should tell the anecdote, well, let me start with the anecdote. One of the things we learned during COVID was we had a lot of expertise that was very applicable to all parts of the ecosystem because we could help answer the questions. I mean, there were regulators calling, there were providers calling, there were health plans calling, and there were employees calling, help me know what to do. So that was one. We started realizing that our expertise was very useful, and we started harnessing that better. As we told the story that we've been talking about, how this lines up to outcomes, and as we had better stories from our own work of how we could see where coverage changes saved money that promoted somebody's ability to afford other things or drove coverage that afford them to get the right care. Candidly, we came out of that whole period growing like hotcakes. We from, hitting kind of 2022 forward had a period of explosive growth. In financial terms, people sometimes measure sort of the rate of top line growth associated with the bottom line growth, called the rule of, and we went from lagging behind most of our peers in our space to starting to lead. So I think the thing we saw was we could make an impact at the individual patient level. We got motivated by that, but it drove the alignment, the traction in the C-suite drove explosive growth. that was very compelling, times hard to manage, but very compelling to see the marketplace resonate. So everybody does the S-shaped curve to show growth. I would argue our bottom slope was pretty long, and then we hit the steep part pretty rapidly, 22, 23, 24.
And it sounds like, that was not luck. I mean, you guys had to make some very intentional refinements to really reposition your value in the context of what mattered to the customer, and in turn patients, obviously on an individual level. So congratulations to everyone for that success. Let's maybe explore what leaders should do before they spend to scale, so they can avoid years of market resistance or worse, market indifference. Nothing would be more depressing than the amount of years and investment that goes into bringing innovation to market in healthcare, and then is kind of met with crickets. And so, do you attribute your success to strategy, luck, both?
Well, definitely luck. I think it's hard to hear the story I've just told about the number of iterations we went through and throwing spaghetti at the wall and not envision some luck there. I think I really go back to, improving listening of the customer. And I think, you've worked with my team and with our marketing department, working on voice of the customer, connecting that to the product team. Those things started giving us more predictable improvements in the product components that we were positioning. Also, some of our clients, as we listened to them, some of our existing clients started looking at our results in different ways that helped us describe then our impact. Some of it was financial, but some of it was also in identifying patients with underdiagnosed conditions. We did a case study with one group on underdiagnosed chronic kidney disease, and they had not viewed what we were doing through that lens until we started saying, gee, we can match up some of our insights on the testing results with some of what you're seeing in claims data. So that was very compelling. We started having customers say, hey, given you have these diagnostic insights, could you take a look at our drug spend and see whether or not we've got the right drug spend? So I think that it was in many ways listening and attaching to outcomes, but also then part of the listening was the customer saying, gee, now that you can do this, can you do X? And X gave us the chance to do that land and expand a little bit. But I probably would argue instead of, it was a hard pivot to go from pushing the problem to listening to the solution. And I think pushing was an easier tendency for me and therefore for the company. So I think if I had to hang my hat, listening and then aligning the product to that, voice of the customer was critical to us in positioning what we were doing for a living to the outcomes they cared about.
It's interesting. Gray Matter has been around for almost 20 years. I feel like one of the fatal mistakes companies make, which you guys recognized and avoided, was they go to market and double down on what they believe based upon the assumptions that they have. And you guys maybe had some assumptions, but you were smart enough and agile enough to recognize, hey, like we're not quite on the same page. Let's listen, let's explore this, let's peel the layer of the onion and back and away so that we can really understand how they describe the problem. Do they think about it in this way? How do we get to become a must-have, not a nice-to-have? And making those refinements, it sounds like, really helped you capitalize on those deep customer insights, but it wasn't, one and done. It's something you've continued to keep as almost a North Star, so you can recognize how to be as timely and relevant to your audience, but in more expansive ways. Is that fair to say?
It's very fair. And I would add that the customer needs change too. So there's both we had to iterate as we listened. And so what are some examples? So if you had asked me the number one value prop we were delivering, it was the cost savings, because I have been in seats at the health plan where we had to hit affordability. And I know there's still people sitting in those seats. As we started listening, some of our customers said, no, it's really the fact that you bring the best in class science for diagnostic testing, not only on what the science says should be done, but how to use the results to take a look at it. So that it's your scientific expertise, the fact that you've developed this internal capability to codify science, to collect results, to compare results to other data sets and give us insights. That's really compelling. But then over time it's been, but now I need more transparency in what you're doing, as an example. So I think it had to be iterative. Perfection was not sort of available to us as a way to launch in retrospect. And that iteration still evolves as their needs evolve and as the pressure points they feel evolve. And so I think it's definitely not a develop a product and launch it and you're done. It's get going, learn from what you're doing, learn from what they're saying, try to refine, and then keep going.
It's interesting you say that. I agree. But it's a little bit, it flies in the face of what a lot of companies think, which is like, we've made this investment, we're locking it down. We're going to hire, experienced salespeople. We're going to put it into the world. And there's almost this, inflexibility of like, this is who we are. This is what we're doing. People just don't get it. We're going to try harder. But it sounds like you're maybe recommending maybe take the opportunity to kind of launch slowly or in a very deliberate manner, so that you're validating, refining, and then when you feel like you've really honed in on the market proposition that resonates and actually is producing not just activity that you want, but also advocacy. It sounds like those people started to become your advocates. It sounds like maybe this go slow to go fast can be very effective in some cases versus let's just, launch a full-blown attack and maybe not take the step to, is this working, not working? How do we refine? So I'm curious, if you were going to do this again, would you repeat it or would you make some adjustments?
So it's funny because, I'm of the age that I remember Steve Jobs standing on the stage doing the iPhone release, and none of us knew we needed a smartphone. And so there's a tendency to think, I've got to go create the smartphone and it's got to be such a wow thing on the release. And we used to have this debate inside, kind of Microsoft was known for release it with bugs and then fix it. And we would go back and forth. I think what we forgot for a while was the smartphones had been out for a while before that got there. And so in some ways, Apple had just learned from the other pieces. So I do think trying to release the perfect solution can be hard. Now, look, we're in a regulated industry. There's a lot of volume, so you have to be careful. But that's why I think pick a narrow enough thing that you can start to drive change, be good at that part, but learn and iterate is critical to the success of the kind of product market fit, but also even your ability to implement and deploy accurately. So I think I was a little too big. I have said this before. I think I was way too wedded to the big bang in a way at the beginning and really trying to force that solution into the marketplace in a way that hampered us for a few years. And then I think we were slow to listen to the customer to modify the iteration to their needs as opposed to what we thought the data told us. So if I did it differently, I would start smaller, iterate faster, and have more of the voice of the customer. And really the voice of the customer tied to what they cared about and where they're willing to change. As I've said, it's a change management process to innovate. Change is hard in general. It's harder in healthcare for a lot of reasons that we've talked about. And so you've got to find your places where they've got urgency so that you can actually get them to then latch onto the change because they feel urgency already.
You made a really great point. I just want to, kind of pause for a second. Some companies think first mover advantage is everything, right? But what you're saying is that's not always true. Apple is a good example. They didn't invent the smartphone, but what they did was redesign that solution and teach people what they had been missing. And it sounds like what you're saying to companies is that even if you're not first, you're far better off finding something that matters to your customer that you can uniquely solve that would get them to, switch from their current, product to something new. So there is always going to be an opportunity to lean into the customer need and intimacy and really identifying what's missing that they may not recognize, right? They may think this is just how it is. This is how this works, but you can still have the insight, the aha moment of recognizing if we change this, if we solve this problem, it would be transformational. And I think that is something that's open to any company, not just the first company in the space.
Yeah, look, I don't want to pretend like I'm the expert on product market fit, but tied to what we've experienced, it has certainly made a difference to learn from the things that didn't work, and then to think a little bit about what you're really good at. So if I just pull on the thread, my own personal opinion about some of the Apple story there, they were good at integrating software and hardware. So as they looked at the phone, what could they do that maybe others couldn't, who were software companies or hardware companies? And I think if you take that analogously to us, it was starting to gain insights not only into where there's waste, but where there's not the right testing happening, and then where the results aren't getting used, and how we could use that information, as I've already said, to connect to an outcome they cared about. So I think that you probably need, at least if I try to extrapolate, you need to also understand what you're good at that could connect to the problems they feel. That seemed to work for us. And I could argue that was how Apple launched their first iPhone.
I 100% agree. It's a great insight. So thanks for highlighting that. You mentioned this idea again of kind of, testing and looking for feedback and evolving. What are some of the clear signals that, you see where we're starting to get a read that we can really, now we're on the right path and we can start to accelerate adoption? What are some of the signs or signals that you would look for to say, we're, check, let's put the gas on the pedal?
So one of the things I felt personally was that we had more C-suite engagement. As I said, what we really felt was our first competition was alternative strategic options. And if you're kind of on the side of the health plan, I grew up on the chief medical officer role and sort of all that outcome-based piece. You only get a few big projects you can do a year that you can champion. And as we started to gain traction in sponsorship from there, I felt like we were starting to resonate more. So I think that was a big one. Weirdly, we had some people starting to come to us as opposed to having to just beat on the door. I thought that was interesting. Some of that's because we also started getting some outcomes. And as I've mentioned before, tying those outcomes, like we had savings, but we could tie it to some anecdotes that showed how patient care was also affected. I think some of our customers helping us talk about those outcomes was really important to us. So we had some very good clients who were willing to say, this is what they've done for us, and willing to speak up on our behalf. I think that's because the outcomes we were delivering, they really cared about too. So C-suite engagement, customer support, people coming to us, those were some of the things I started feeling personally that, this is sort of hitting the mark a little bit more than where we've spent the last few years.
And so my takeaway from what you said is, don't start scaling your commercialization, investment until you start to see those signals.
Yeah, so I take that a step further. So at the time, we were a bit of a waterfall type product development thing, and that's you tend to make pretty big investments and then you go try to sell it. As we became more of an agile development shop, both in product and in tech development, I think getting iterative portions that you can take out to market and figure out what fits before you sort of scale up that big bang investment does make a lot of sense. We had a lot of big investment early. Some of it has stayed with us. Some of it we don't use anymore. So I do think there's sort of besides the iterative approach to product market fit, there's the way you actually bite off pieces of what you're going to deliver that we learned over time. That probably means I wasted a bit of capital early on in the company, quite frankly.
Well, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this conversation, which is, again, just because the product exists and you're ready to sell it doesn't mean the market's ready to adopt it. I mentioned at the top of the hour that 2 out of 3 product launches fail to meet expectations and don't catch up, and so you guys were able to avoid getting sucked into the product adoption lie. So kudos to you and your team. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing what's in store for the company next. You guys keep evolving. To your point, you've not just rested on your laurels and kind of tried to just maintain your offering. You've continued to look for ways to add value, which I think will only continue to not just improve patient care, but also improve the valuation of your company. So congratulations to you.
Well, thank you for all the help. And honestly, the team has had to do a lot of work to teach me how to listen, and they still have to work on that. So hopefully they'll continue to do well.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Holly. That brings us to the close of today's session. And a huge thank you to Dr. Kerr for sharing such sharp and experience-driven insights from the front lines of healthcare. We're going to wrap the main session and move to Q&A. But as we wrap, if you're not going to stay for the Q&A, we'll leave you with a challenge. If your product is a game changer, does your market see the game as needing to change? And so we're going to go to Q&A now and join Bill and Holly again and ask them some questions from our chat.
Okay, I think we're going to have some questions come up here. Let's see. What's first in our queue? If belief is the bottleneck, when do you start building belief, and what's the trigger that tells you it's time? There are no softballs for you, Bill. We're getting right into the complex questions.
Right. So that's a great question. Look, we had conviction of the problem, and I think that gave us the trigger to start the company, but that did not give us belief in the solution for the reason I've outlined. Sort of started with our version and the Big Bang, et cetera. As I said earlier, for me, what drove the belief we were starting to hit the product market fit better was, in fact, the C-suite engagement, the customers willing to speak publicly about what we were doing. Blues of North Carolina was one of my early customers, so was Blues of South Carolina, and they each started speaking up publicly, and I felt like that meant we were resonating. So at least for me personally, those two things were important: customer support for scaling what we were doing, and also prospect C-suite engagement to listen to what we were doing, were two variables for me that I would say said it's time to trigger this.
That's great. That's great insight. Let's see. Up next, what's the best way to pressure test that the market believes the status quo is intolerable before we hire more sales reps or scale spend?
Well, that's a tough one for sure, because status quo is the competition, right? That is the competition to innovation. And how much you invest in a sales team is an important decision. What we were very successful in doing was also looking for channel partnerships that would make that investment a bit more variable. And so I think that has been useful. We had a number of them across the life cycle of the company. So for me, it was, I'm not sure I knew the answer to that as much as I said, maybe the way to manage that is to give us variable sales investment through channel partnerships while we're still fixing some of this product, what now in retrospect we would know to call product market fit. So that was how I chose to handle it, was a bit of a channel partnership approach to let our salespeople be more scaled and more effective without having to invest and build the team directly.
Was that somewhat of a novel approach kind of in your space, or was it just more of a bridge tactic that you
saw? I don't know. I don't know if it's novel, but I can tell you this, like we have for most of our company's life had 3 to 4 key salespeople. And the amount of growth they've driven, most people are surprised. I think the reason is that channel partnership allowed some kind of scaling of them. And that's why we've been able to keep sort of our direct investment a little bit smaller. So again, I don't know if you would call that the norm in healthcare. There certainly are channel partnerships all over healthcare, digital health companies working on employer outreach, things like that. I haven't done many of them, but this has worked for us in this particular case. And we have a very powerful sales force, but they remain small, even though we have grown like hotcakes, as I've said. They're very effective.
It's interesting you make the point, which in my mind is you can do a lot with fewer resources if you have the right story, you kind of know how to position to the audience, and you're met really with you're not met with the resistance, right? You have quicker timelines, smaller sales cycles, you're seeing expansion grow quicker. And that's not the case for a lot of companies that have much larger, infrastructures and footprints, because you really did it different.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's different. We're enterprise sales, right? We're selling business to business. So that's got its own interesting challenges. It's a long sales cycle. We routinely had to debate with our investors, should we invest more in our direct sales channel? And I think over time, we will continue to have that debate. We now have a large customer base. And one of the things that happens there is you start cross-selling them some of those land and expand products. And that's a whole different group of people. We've actually invested a bit more there because we think that is less open to channel partnership success. So for us, the channel partnership to scale our sales team and have the top of the funnel sort of handled by other people was very useful. As we're landing and expanding, we are finding the direct management of the relationship more compelling. So that's what's worked for us. I think it'd be a misnomer for me to pretend like I'm an expert on sort of how to do that across, say, software companies that are going to have a very different approach to the enterprise sale process. I'm a tech-enabled service in a way, if you sort of think about what they're having to implement, and maybe that's a little bit different.
That's super helpful. Okay, what's our next question? Let's see. How do you create urgency when the buyer says it's interesting, but clearly is not, not a priority right now?
I think what we had to do was try to learn what was urgent to the client. And I think that was the big thing. We were trying to create urgency. You have a burning platform and you need us as your solution. I think what we got better at listening to what was important to them and urgent to them, we started finding ways to connect what we did to that outcome. So I would argue I'm not sure you can create urgency as much as you can learn what's already urgent, at least in my space and with the customer base I primarily focused on.
I think it goes back to don't rest on assumptions, right? Make sure you know what that is for your customer. That's great. Let's see. To what degree has the patient consumer narrative enabled adoption versus the enterprise value proposition?
So it's a great question, Juan. Thank you for that. Healthcare is interesting because the patient, there's a third-party player in the system, right? You got the doctor and the patient, and then you've got the health plan and the role it's playing. We ultimately value the doctor-patient being able to access the right lab testing and use the results correctly, but we have to be sensitive to how we get involved in the exam room is the way I talk about it. So I believe that some of the outcomes that were more clinically relevant resonated with the enterprise customer and allowed them to say this solution is good for my patient-doctor relationship. But we have been hesitant to insert ourselves in there because there's a lot of different things pinging that relationship, and we have not wanted to create what I call kind of the white noise effect, sort of that another flag. I guess I'm sounding too much like an Apple commentator, but I always think about the Apple user agreement and how fast I scroll through it now that it's 72 pages long. So it's having no meaning to me. I don't want to be that. So I think connecting our outcomes to the patient consumer is compelling, but we have not been the one who has directly affected or interacted. We've affected, but we haven't interacted with the patient consumer to date. So I think connecting outcomes, but we've been sensitive about whether to connect to them has been important to us.
It's a great distinction. If you're the only game in town, how would you set the pricing for growth and market adoption, or keep it high due to the scarcity of the product?
It's a good question. How to price a product when there is not a comparative. The thing we talk about is, customers don't know what to pay us because they can't spreadsheet us. They can't sort of say, here's 3 versions and I want to do this. We have chosen to price our products as a percentage of value created. And that value created has primarily been an affordability component tied maybe to some data outcome insight component. And one of the reasons we've chosen to do that is because we think about the renewal. We worry that if we price too high too early, it's going to affect the renewal. And so we think the long-term game is better being rationally priced. We tend to target sort of getting 20-25% of the value created in whatever value prop we're talking about as what we're owed. And we feel like that's been a good investment for the customer, but not an overreach on our part. I hate to say this out loud, but I grew up in a part of I don't hate to say this part. I grew up in part of the country that's rural, and I grew up on a farm, and there's an old phrase there: pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. And we did not want to be overreaching in the long term. So that's how we've chosen to price.
I think it's an interesting point, Bill, which is the higher the value, though, obviously people are willing to pay more of a premium. But if you are one of many options, then you start to you have to start compete on price, right? So by being truly different and unique, you create a bit of a moat that might help you preserve those pricing margins.
That has worked for us for sure. And even at renewals, we've been lucky to continue to say, we believe we're owed this portion of value creation, but tying it to the outcomes has been critical. And, I'm not sure I would know how to price differently than as a percentage of the value created. Otherwise, it feels harder for me to argue for why I can ask for the price I'm asking for me.
I don't know if we have time for one more or wrapping up.
I think we're a wrap on Q&A. So thank you to everybody who watched, and Bill especially for being a part of our MarketRX today, and just highlighting how you approached innovation and market adoption. So thank you so much, and join us again when we do this again in June.